Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the third webcast in our ThingWorx UI series, Reimagine Your Application UI with Collection and CSS in ThingWorx 8.2. I'm Clint Detweiler-Alderfer, and I will be your moderator for today's event. Our speaker today is Gabriel Bucor, who serves as an IoT design specialist on the technology platform here at PTC. Gabriel has over 10 years' experience as an interactive designer and is responsible for driving UI and user experience strategies that reflect the power of the ThingWorx platform. We are presenting to you today a pre-recording of this webinar due to bandwidth limitations with the ON24 platform. However, Gabriel will be available throughout the webinar to help answer any questions you may have. You can post all questions in the Q&A pane at the bottom of your screen. In the event we are unable to get back to you during the webcast, we will address all your inquiries during our Q&A, or have our team members follow up with you directly after the session. If you do experience any issues listening to or viewing today's webcast, please refer to the event help guide link I will provide attendees via our group chat. We also recommend viewing this webinar in Firefox for an optimal experience. One last note before we get started. We'll be recording today's webcast with Q&A included, and we'll send the recording to all registrants as soon as it's made available. And with that, I'll go ahead and get us started.
Hello everyone, my name is Gabriel Bucor. I am a web designer here at PTC, and today we're going to talk about the two new features in ThingWorx 8.2, which are the Collection widget and CSS. So we're going to start off by describing what the Collection widget is and how does it do it. Then we're going to populate the Collection widget with data and how do we populate with the Collection widget. After that, I'm going to show you these two. How do you achieve these two different types of layouts? Then we're going to talk about some the sections, the global property of this Collection widget, and then we're going to go in CSS custom class. How do you get a custom class? How do you style a widget, and so on? And then we're going to combine by using the collection and CSS at the end. So let's start off with what is the Collection widget. The Collection widget is a replacement for the repeater. The collection is way better for performing than the repeater. So how does it achieve that? So for example, in my left pane here, I have a repeated mashup with a random number. And the collection basically renders what is in my view. So in this part of the scroll that I have here until the bottom, it renders those cells, and when I scroll, it basically moves the cells from the top and populates the rest of the data. Why does it do that? So it kind of renders as many things that you have in view at a time because it needs to be performant. Loading, let's say, for example, I don't have 50 cells here. I have, let's say, 1,000, right? So 1,000 would be kind of heavy for the browser to render each and every one of these, so I scroll through them. But when I have these many in my view and the collection reuses those cells, it doesn't modify the DOM that much, and it doesn't populate the DOM that much, so the browser struggles with it. It happens in every browser. You have to keep things performant in order to have a better experience in your app. So that's how it does all of this. Now I'm gonna show you how to populate the data into the collection. So let's select here. So this is my mashup, and here is my Collection widget. So first of all, you have to select a mashup that you want repeated. That mashup of mine is this one. I have basically one label that is binded to a mashup parameter named value. It's a number. And I get it to a text, but that doesn't matter. The label accepts more types of data. Let's go back. I have the size of my cell here. I have a unique identifier. So in order for the collection to work, you need a unique identifier for each of your data row. So for example, if you have a grid and you have lots of entries, you have to make sure that you have a unique identifier in one of those columns, because that's how the collection tracks the cells and knows which cell you clicked on, in order to achieve more functionality after that. For example, you have all of these different events. So for example, you have has cell selected. So if you don't have any cell selected, it won't trigger this. But if you have, you can get that event to something else and trigger something in your app. Or you can use all these different events. For example, click, double click, right click, long click, and so on. The next properties. So in my case, this is a timestamp, because I know that my random data generator here generates a timestamp and some numbers, and I know that timestamp doesn't repeat itself. So that's how I know. Then you have some sections, padding, some layout properties, and then you have these settings. I think these settings are one of the most important here, because, for example, I have row spacing 10 pixels, and in my case, the cells don't touch each other vertically. And then I have a minimum spacing of also 10 pixels, so they don't touch each other horizontally. Then I have some padding top and bottom, so it doesn't stick to the top or at the bottom, because when I scroll down, you can see this. The last cell doesn't touch the bottom, so you can scroll a bit more to see it all. How do you populate data? You have to write a JSON array. So how is this JSON array? Let me get a notepad here because it's a bit bigger. So I basically bind the value from the info table, the column from the info table rather, to the mashup parameter. And you can do this several times divided by a comma. And for example, b and value 2, right? So we don't. So you do it like this. So as many parameters as you have is good for the collection. This is way better than having to select. For example, you have the mashup parameter here, and then you select the row from the info table. In my case, in here, because from a drop down is way better, because you might not have all the properties in your mashup, so you pre-populate this with all your bindings. But these are basically bindings from the info table to the mashup parameters. And for example, you can use it for a selected mashup, because ThingWorx has a selected mashup, and I'll show you a bit later how this works. But maybe a selected mashup doesn't have the same information as the initial mashup that you have repeated in your collection, right? And you have also styles for different states of the cells. For example, I have white for my normal, blue for my selected, and if you see here, if I select it, it will go blue. Okay, and you also have a border radius, so you make this nice corner, and also a shadow, which is a standard shadow, like in CSS. All right, so that's how you populate data. Now let's talk about how you achieve these different types of layout. So this is pretty obvious. It's just a repeated mashup. I have some random data here. It repeats basically 50 times, and that's it. But how do you achieve this one? Because this one has two different types of mashups, and they look totally different. This is a gauge, and this is a chart. So let's see how this data looks, which populates this side of the mashup. We go here to the info table, and we see it here. So I have basically the exact mashup name. Each of these gauges here are their own mashup. Right, so I have their mashup names here, and I can define in two other columns a width and a height in pixels. So when I display them, because they are responsive, in my mashups here are basically huge, but if they are responsive, they won't. The collection will display them at that exact size. So let's open this mashup here. So as you can see, it is basically a responsive mashup with a responsive gauge in the middle. So let's go back to the layout mashup. So that's how it does it. But how do you populate that? So you have to pre-select some mashup for this. At the moment, you have to do this, but and you also have to use a unique identifier. In my case, it's mashup name because it's not repeated, and I'm really sure that that mashup is a unique identifier. And I have my layout properties here, which we'll talk about in a second. Some spacing between the cells, and here I define which field I want my mashup name from. So in my case, is that column in my info table, which is mashup name, and those widths where I define here, so I know that it won't be responsive, so it will have a random size. It will have the exact size that I defined it in my info table. I'm not allowing selection because I don't need selection for this type of layout. All the states are basically white, and I also define some shadows and the border radius, so they look kind of nice, like these ones. Right, so let's go to the flow layout. So these properties that you saw here. The flow layout, gravity, align, and content gravity. What do these mean? I mean, these are more important than the others because those are just aligning to the top and bottom and so forth. But these are kind of hard to understand, but I'll show you what they do now. So you have 4 different types. They are edge, space, center, and expand. And let's start with edge. So edge, it will display the cells at the size that I defined them. Actually, let's go into the flow layout mashup where I have that mashup, and we'll see here that we have those 4 collections. They are populated from the exact same service. So as you can see, if I select one, the others will the others will select because they are populated from the same service. And I have this edge layout here on the top, right? So this will put the cells on the edge. I know that if I go back here, I have a height of 50 pixels and a width of 150. So it is the exact size of this cell, for example. And it will have equal spacing between the cells, the edge layout. The spaced layout, it will have exact space between the cells and also on the edges. And the center layout will basically draw the cells next to each other in the center. The expand layout will basically divide all the available space to those cells and use that 150 pixels here from the mashup width as a minimum width. So for example, if my cell can't occupy 150 pixels, like I'll show you here, and I'll just move a bit and a bit to show where it will collapse, it will go to the next row. So it will never be smaller than what I defined it, because I might have some sensitive content there and I don't want it to be hidden if the cell is too small. So for example, if I want to, for this center layout, maybe I don't want them to be, let's go again here, I don't want them to be in the center like this and touch each other, because that's kind of, I don't want my content mixed up. I go to the minimum spacing between the cells, and I say, let's say 20 pixels, and also for the expand, I'll do the same, 20 pixels. Let's also do it for the edge layout, 20 pixels. And for the space layout, which is also 20 pixels. So what is minimum spacing? Because all the layouts are kind of different from each other, you'll see that they work differently in the spacing between them. So it will have a minimum spacing between them no matter what the width. So if it can't occupy that width in in between the cells. For example, here, yeah, it does have more than 20 pixels, but if it can't occupy that, they will the next cell will go to the next row, and then again it will divide that space between them even larger. The center layout will just put 10 pixels between them. Also with the expand layout, we will just take care of that a fixed 20 pixels. And the space layout is basically the same as the edge, but it also has space at the edge, left and right. So these are the four settings for the layout, so you know how to arrange your content and how it flows based on how many cells you have. One other nice thing that the collection has is sections. So what you can do with sections is separate your content based on some parameter. For example, I have some odd and even numbers here, and in my case I have, for example, I have this 7 here, which is not an even number. Well, how does that info table look? And how do sections work? Let's go to that thing and look to the... Actually, let's open also the mashup with the sections. So here I have, so you can use sections for the header and the footers, whichever you choose. And let's go to the sections thing. Yeah, there it is. So I have an info table here, and it's basically the item label, which is the number that I display in the cell, and then I have a section name. And that section name is basically a string, and if the string is the same for two of my cells, it will put them in their respective section. Like we see here, 7 is obviously not an even number, so let's modify that. Let's go to and edit 7 here, and this is odd. Set, save, and if I refresh here, now I will have 4 with 4, so it doesn't look odd anymore. So that's how you use sections. So how do you define sections? If I go here in my layout, I will define the parameter that defines the section. Here you have section field. I define this with section name. So from my info table, here, let's go to. So it's item label and section name. I have here populated my data with item label from the info table and the value, because I use basically the same mashup. I repeat from here and here and here. It's basically the same mashup. And way down here we have headers. So I choose to show headers because I want to show that odd number. And I have another mashup in which I have a parameter, just like the mashup I use here, but that parameter is header value. So the collection knows if you show it the mashup parameter. Let's open this mashup. And if you show it the mashup parameter, which I define here as a string, it will put the name of that section, which you defined earlier on top. It will put the name of that section in that label, and there it is. You have odd, and even numbers. And you can also do that for footers as well. Again, you select this, you can define a height and use that. You also have stick, I think it's headers. Yeah, you have headers pinned to top, so if you have way more than them, you'll have the header stick to the top, and it will change based on where you're on the scroll. If you have so many of them that you can't even count, but you still want the section, so you don't have to scroll up to see which section that mashup is from, it will stick to the top. So you just play around with it, see what you can achieve. I think it's really awesome. Global property. So since the release, we had a lot of questions. What is global property? What does it do? Well, let's get to that, and I'll explain it. Here I have a checkbox and 2 datetime speakers, and here I have a collection, right? In my collection, I have a time series chart, which I repeat. It has random data in it. It's basically populated within the mashup. I don't pass any parameters from here. But here I have global properties. So what are these global properties? Let me get my notepad here and paste this so we'll see, so we can dissect this. So the global property is basically, this is the name of my property and I define it as a boolean. The start date and end date, I define them as date time. And you basically bind from this, I get the state and drag it, and you'll see that I have is checked here. And for the datetime, also datetime, you drag it, and you'll see that I have start date and end date exactly how I define them in global properties. What can you do with these global properties? Well, let's go to the mashup that contains that time series chart, because that's where I use those properties. Here I have a signal service that generates random data based on what data you give it. So I have bound my, let's get this a bit bigger so we can see these. So I've bound my my start date and end date to the parameters here, and interval end in the interval start. And I also bound my, as you remember earlier, I had also a checkbox, and for that I used it to collapse or expand the header. So if it expanded or not, the checkbox will tell it. Let's see how it works. So if I check the checkbox, it will affect all the cells, by the way, that's why it's called a global property. And let's choose for the start date this, and there you go. It gets that start date and end date to all my cells here, not only one. And one other thing you can do in the collection is have a different cell on selection. So a different mashup rather on selection. So what do is when you click on it, for example here, I have a totally different mashup with a whole another chart. So how did I do that? Well, let's go back to the global property here. And we'll see that we have another input for a mashup name here, which is selected mashup name. It's basically an alternative to not having, for example, when you have the selected style of the mashup, because that will just change the background. By the way, to show this background, you will have to make your mashup background transparent. And if you want to show another mashup, for example, maybe you have more data that you want to show on selection or something, you just put a different mashup, which is a label chart in my case, and use the same parameters, because that's why I told you that is way better with a JSON array, because you can define way more parameters that you can, for example, you can do with the repeater. Given the fact that you have a selection mashup, and in your selected mashup you might not have the same parameters as in your normal mashup, like this one. Maybe in this one I have some other parameters. Alright, so this is the selection. So basically you can, in my case I just use to switch from one chart to another based on which one I select. Right, now let's go to the CSS and how does this work. So in Eda2 we have a new tab here, custom CSS, and if I go to it, I don't have anything in this mashup, but let's go to the custom CSS mashup. And in the custom CSS mashup I have a button, right? I'll explain to you this a bit later, but let's go into the basics of CSS. Right, so if I go here to custom CSS, you can basically write pure CSS and do whatever you want. But it's kind of before it was kind of hard to target CSS on mashups. Rather, we didn't have any CSS; you just have to build your own custom widget. But now it's native, and you can use it. So I have here defined a custom button shadow as a custom class to my button. And I have a few styles here, a lighter blue for the hover, and the darker blue for the active, basically when I press down on the button. Let's see what the CSS here does. So I define a shadow for my button, a transition for the shadow, because you define a transition for the shadow on the initial state. As you see here on the hover state, I define another shadow. It's a bit different. And on the active state, basically when you click down on it, the shadow will disappear. I have also border radius. I have an overflow hidden because the border radius isn't on the div that gives me the color of the button. So let's inspect this and see what's here. So here is my button shadow class. And if I go here, I have the shadow that I defined, the transition, the border radius, and the overflow hidden. And if you see, let's make this 15 pixels so it's more obvious. As you see, it's way more rounder now. But if I uncheck the overflow hidden so it doesn't apply that, as you see, my button is square. Well, why is that? Because the color is not applied on the button itself, but an element within that. So the button color is applied on the button element here, in my case. So but the button element, as you see, is square and doesn't have any border radius or anything. So that's why you have to hide everything that goes beyond the bounds of this div here, which is my button shadow, which I target. What else do we have? So I have a button element. So I basically target the button element here. So I target the button shadow, and within that there's a button element class. And for that button element class, I define a transition of the background. But let me see where it is. There it is. So I define the transition for the background because I wanted to switch nicely between the colors and not switch in an instant. So because that looks kind of choppy, so it's way more easier and define more context to your button that way. And as you saw, I have box shadow none on my button for the click. And so I hover, the shadow becomes bigger, and when I click it, it won't have any shadow because it will apply that CSS that I have here on active is box shadow none. Now let's talk about how do you use the property for this. So let's go to design. And how do you use the binding of the custom class? So why would you use that? Well, if you want your elements to be defined based on the data and you want to define that with CSS, you can do that. So you can basically output from somewhere from your service some classes, because by the way, you can define classes like this with, for example, 1 and height 1. I know that I have these classes defined in my CSS, so you basically space your classes with one space. That's how you define different classes on the same element, right? But I have it here bounded by an expression. So what is that? Let's go here first to this thing and let's see what this thing does. First of all, we'll see here that we have a width and a height. It's 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 2, and 1, 2. I don't use this as an actual width. I just use it to basically concatenate a string to build up my CSS class, right? So I have here the item name for my collection on top. As you see here, it's an item name. And then I have the width 1, 1, like it is here basically defined in the actual name. So let's see how this works. Let's go back to the mashup. I lost it here. There we go. So I get data from that. I define my item name to the cell name on the top. And to this, I have an expression here that outputs to this custom class of this panel. So what does this expression output? Let's copy this and paste it in our trusty notepad here. And let's see what parameters this expression has. So I have underline width and an underline height. They are both strings. And what I do with them is basically add my panel. In my case, this my panel class is just basically having a background for that panel, having a border radius, and a transition for the width and height. Why do I want a transition for the width and height? Because I defined different widths based on what I select. Here I have the width 1 and width 2. For the width 1 I have 200 pixels, width 2 400, and same for the height, right? With height. If we go back to this, so when I select a cell from the top here, you'll see that I have basically a square, it's 1, 1, but when I select this one, it will go 2 and 1. Because I have, for this expression, I have bound height and width from the selected rows. So basically when I select a row, the height and width, that 1 and 2, will go to the expression. They are bound, as you can see here, they are bound to the width and height. And I basically build a string of classes, of CSS classes. So what the result of this would be, if I click, for example, on the first cell, which is here 1, 1. So this would be my panel plus with it's not plus, with 1 and height 1. And if I get this, input it into my panel here, I already have defined the CSS classes here, and my panel here would take that exact size of my panel. But we can go even bigger than that. For example, maybe I want, when I select this border color red. Sorry. So let's save this. So it's on width 2, and whenever I have width 2, let's refresh this. Whenever I have width 2, the border will go red. As you can see, whenever the first number here is 2, the border will go red. So that's how you can define custom classes based on how you basically how you deal with your data and how you input data into your ThingWorx platform. I have here another application. Maybe you already saw it. It's basically a demo that we did for the release of these two features, and I will show it to you right away. And this is a more defined application. You will have the files for this when you will receive the recording of this. So, like I showed you, you can build basically layouts out of different mashups with the collection. So all of this here is a collection. The header is the collection. Each of these charts is a collection, and this grid with its header here is also a collection. Rather, not a collection. Each are their own mashups. And like I showed you, when you have a minimum width for your cells, in my case, I think I have 400 here. I defined the width for my cells, and they can't occupy that. They will go and wrap beneath each other, and as you see, they are not side to side anymore. They are one above each other. You can also, for example, I have a current password here. All of this layout is arranged with CSS and everything. And for example, if I write a random password here, I will write 1234, 1234. It will compare these two, because I have some expression that compared it. And when I defocus this, it sees that they are the same. But if I add another number, fields do not match, and the save button will go disabled. That's a nice functionality. It's a way to show the user, no, you don't have the permission to save it because the fields aren't right. I can do the same to check the actual password, because I do that with a service and I have to trigger it first. So let's see that these two passwords are the same. and the current password is just a random string. And when I save it, the service calls that, and with custom class, I get an error class in here. Let's see how this looks. And where is it? So I have here input password, and I have some styling for that, and I have an error input with which I basically make the border red, so the user has an input of, okay, this is wrong, I have to do something with it, right? So one other thing I forgot to explain to you was how did I build this label to stay in the center. Well, this is also done with CSS. So let's go to the main layout here. Layout mashup. And is this the right one? No, it's the gauge. Layout mashup, there we go. So let's make this bigger. And I have this mashup here. And in this mashup, I just basically have a panel and a label. That's all I have. And this label is basically absolute positioning. As you can see, the top and left here will change based on that. But as you saw in my cells here, the label is actually in the dead center. So how is that? Well, you'll see here that I have a label sender class on it. This weight 600 is basically a way for me to make the text a bit bolder so it looks way nicer. So this label center here is a class which I defined in my CSS in my master here. My master which contains the menu, by the way. And my master looks like this, so you know what to look for when you get the files. And the custom CSS looks like this. And here I have the styling of my label and how I center it. So basically what I define is, so that label won't have a fixed size, it will be 100 and 100%. Top and left won't be a thing anymore because they will be auto. I don't care if it's 10 pixels or 50, I want it to be auto in order for me to center it, right? And then I target the widget label. This widget label contains in it a span with that text that gets populated, and I want that span to go center. So let's inspect here and see how it's that. This is the widget label, as you see here in my code, widget label. And I have, so what does this widget label? I use flexbox in order to center my my label here. So I might have to refresh it because yeah, there we go. So I use flexbox in order to center my label here, and I have display flex. This is basically the parent of this span because the span is within that. And all items in this widget label will stay center and will justify center. So for example, if I align items, it will be flex end. As you see, all my labels went down. If they will be flex start, they will be up. But I want them to be center, and they will be center. Yeah. So this is basically how you build a with the collection widget, and you can use all kinds of different stuff. For example, if I click a cell here, I can use these different classes because, as you saw, these are all the cells of the collection. As you can see them here, then they get selected on top. This one is different from this one, as you see, because the selected one has a collection view cell selected, and you can use that that class to style whatever is in your cell. In my case, for example, as you see, it's the black text, and then when I select it is white. So how is that? Well, in this case, I wanted my my cell here. So you can select the collection view wrapper, and actually, I think it's way easier to show you here. Yeah. So I target my ID, because this selector is basically somewhere in there. There's an ID that has collection 20, and then I target that class, and I target the selected, and everything within that selected cell should have the color white as a text, right? So that's what it does. I have a few more of that applied here, as you can see, but it's only on the normal cell and not on the selected one, as you can see. So I think this concludes my demo here. We'll move on to the Q&A section, and I hope I can answer your questions.
All right. Well, as Gabriel mentioned, that does conclude today's presentation portion. One note before we open up Q&A, if you are interested in getting familiar with this technology and playing around with the features that Gabriel demonstrated here, please go check out our developer portal. We'll be making all entities from this presentation available, including the finalized mashup that Gabriel showed here. But as I mentioned earlier, we'll also be sending them to you directly as well. So if you do have any questions, feel free to submit them now. We actually have a couple questions already. So for you, Gabriel, does PTC plan on making any CSS tutorials?
So he is responsible for CSS. We are, however, responsible for teaching people how to use the features that use CSS in
Okay. Can I apply custom CSS for any widget?
So at the moment, you can't apply to all the widgets. The majority of them have a custom class, but there are some of them like which have it. But there is a workaround. Is you can apply a class to a container that has that value in. For example, if you have just a class to the left bar, and yeah, that might be my internet here. So I'm currently so can you hear me okay?
You're coming in clear now, Gabriel, but you are breaking up a little bit.
Okay, so not all the widgets have the custom class, but you can apply, the majority of them have it. For example, the menu doesn't have it. And apply a custom class widget is to apply a class to the container of that widget. For example, if you have a menu bar, I put your in there and target that your menu.
Does custom CSS override the widget styles?
Yes, target them, and based on specificity, yeah, you can rewrite. That's what basically CSS does. It rewrites styles. Default thing.
Gabriel, you are still breaking up. If there's any way you can adjust your audio.
On my phone.
All right. Why does the trending speed chart show the line doubling back on itself?
So can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
All right. So yes, you can rewrite that's what basically CSS does in ThingWorx. You can rewrite the default styles of ThingWorx, and you can apply
other styles that are not available with the cell definition to the widget.
Okay, and how would the performance be when viewing a mashup that has a collection of about 50 to 100 items?
So the thing is, the collection is way performant than the repeater, for example. It does perform good with a lot, as you saw in my demo there. It does perform good with a lot of widgets, with a lot of cells rather. But one thing that you have to remember, it doesn't really render other cells that you don't see in your scroll. It basically reuses the same cells that it initially rendered. So it doesn't matter, for example, in my example, if I had 100,000 rows, it didn't matter for the collection because when I scroll, it basically moves the same cells and reuses them all, again and again based on where my scroll is. Because that offers better performance to reuse cells and not get the DOM cluttered with all the divs from 100,000 rows.
All right, and how do you target a widget that doesn't have a custom class property?
So yeah, I'm going to repeat this. So for example, not all the widgets have the custom class. For example, the menu doesn't have it. They are in the works. All the widgets will eventually have a custom class. So for the moment, if you need to use the custom class on a widget that doesn't have it, you can target and put a class on the container of that widget. For example, if you have a menu that sits in the left bar, you can put a class on that left bar and then target your menu stylus however you want from that left bar and down in the DOM.
Okay. Should the new collection widget be considered the default go-to when organizing or specifying overall page layout?
Not really. The layout is still very powerful and can do a lot of stuff. But if you want scrollable content, like I showed you in the later app, with the charts and everything, if you want scrollable content, the collection is good at that and can display cells, can display different mashups based on the height that you define in the info table that populates that.
All right, very good. Well, I think that is all the questions we have for today, and I do apologize to everyone for any audio issues you experienced, but I'd like to thank you all for joining. As I mentioned earlier, we will send a recording of this webcast via email once it's available. If you do have any additional questions, please feel free to post them either to the developer community or send a note via the developer portal. I hope you found today's session valuable, and we'll join us again next week where we'll demonstrate how you can use visualizations to help your users understand what really matters most in your data. Thanks, everyone.